Althusser presents the scene in the text by arguing that ideology acts in such a way that it recruits subjects amongst the individuals. It recruits them all, he stipulates. Or it transforms the individuals into subjects. It transforms them all, he stipulates, through what he calls interpellation or hailing, which he says can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday police or other hailing, "Hey, you there." According to Althusser's own description, the hailed individual will turn around. By this mere 180-degree physical conversion, he becomes a subject. Why? Because he has recognized that the hail was really addressed to him, and it was really him who was hailed and not someone else. Experience shows, Althusser writes, that the practical telecommunication of hailings hardly ever miss their man. Verbal call or whistle, the one hailed already recognizes that it is really him who is being hailed. He then concludes, it's a strange phenomenon, and one which cannot be explained solely by guilty feelings, despite the large numbers who have something on their consciences. The question, I think, then immediately arises. What are the implications of Althusser's claim that ideology recruits or transforms each and every subject through interpellation? Or put somewhat differently, does it suffice to lean on the argument that interpellation works 9 times out of 10 without taking into account the implications of this possible failure, the ways in which interpellation misses its mark, that the subject does not respond, but stares back blankly? One of Althusser's harshest critics on this score, Jacques Rancière, has argued that the materialization of ideology in Althusser's argument once more turns ideology into a machinery which irremediably traps any subject. Borrowing the analysis of the mirror stage from Lacanian psychoanalysis, he continues, Althusser twists its meaning in order to understand it as providing an entire theory of the subject. Thus, he identifies political subjection with the subjection to the very idea of the subject. Every subject is caught in subjection as soon as it recognizes its image and answers its name. As he concludes, the theoretical leftism of the theory of ideological interpretation returns us once more to a form of Platonism. If this scene of interpellation and its consequences has indeed been rehearsed again and again, Judith Butler has recalled to us that it is, in fact, only the first of 2 significant moments of interpellation in Althusser. For after he had indeed strangled his own wife, he records in his autobiography that he had rushed out into the street to hail the police, thereby delivering himself up to the law. No doubt there's a certain symmetry, one might even call it an ironic symmetry, between the 2 scenes, which appears to hinge around questions of conscience and guilt and the law, and so forcing us to ask, as Butler elaborates, on whether interpellation requires a theory of conscience. But I think the irony is less interesting than the way these scenes of interpellation are indeed multiple. For Althusser's first example in the ISA is not, as repeatedly stated, the encounter between the police and the hailed subject, but the encounter between 2 friends. He also refers to the encounter between 2 people who recognize each other on the street and shake hands, a material ritual practice, he says, of ideological recognition, but one that is also situated around the scene of interpellation. Even the scene in which the police hails a subject, there's a clause in the demonstration that acknowledges that the hailing might come from someone other than the police, which then leads to a curious footnote in which Althusser acknowledges that hailing as an everyday practice, "Hey, you there," takes a quite special form in this instance. In fact, this is a section of the text in which there are few lines not littered with scare quotes, clauses, guarded footnotes. So that while we have come to assume that interpellation by the law leads to a quite specific form of ideological or disciplinary subjectification or capture, the practices of interpellation are indeed several, touching on the limits of what we might call their totalizing subsumption under the terms of ideological misrecognition. The question thus becomes how to rethink this ideological closure, this closure of the subject, as what Rancière calls the very idea of the subject. Or rather, if we have numerous commentaries about how different practices reproduce the ideological or discursive constitution of the subject, how must we also think the resistance or with the withdrawal of the subject to this very idea? As Rancière suggests, and others have pursued at some length, certainly one possible alternative would be to question Althusser's misreading of Lacan, as if it is the mirror apparatus that traps Althusser in some form of Platonic double-bind. Conversely, whatever the importance of psychoanalysis in Althusser's writings, there exist other ways of thinking these references to interpellation. Thus, Emmanuel Levinas refers with some frequency to the same term, as in some important passages in Totality and Infinity, where the rapport with the other might begin to open at least a rereading of Althusser's argument. Likewise, we might imagine different readings of Althusser's references to friendship, and so on. But if other readings of interpellation are no doubt possible, we're still left with the question of the state that frames Althusser's essay in the first place, still left with the way in which the subject is only ever a function of the state, subject to capture, so that ideology at best is understood as a statist notion and not necessarily a political one. To rephrase it somewhat differently, and to bring us back to the beginning, to what extent is the problem less the plurality of possible scenes in which interpellation takes place, less the apparatus as the site of capture and desubjectification, than the ways in which the interpellation of the subject reproduces the way the state represents what has already been presented. And so a problematic again of presentation and not representation. In short, to what extent is the scene of interpellation in its very presentation in Althusser's text more precarious than the conceptual unfolding of the argument suggests? We know that Althusser's text turns with almost obsessive insistence around questions of demonstration, exposition, metaphor, what he calls a special mode of exposition that is fully part of his thinking, and that, in his disarmingly simple phrase, makes something visible. The insistence on the demonstration and exposition of the argument coincides with repeated references to theatre in the text, including, he says, views behind the scenes of an ideological state apparatus, which itself occupies the front of the stage, as well as various references to acts and performances. My little theoretical theatre, Althusser writes, with actors in this mise en scène of interpellation. Of course, the metaphor of theatre is also Marx's metaphor. In his attempt to establish the structure and articulation of the capitalist mode of production, it's Marx who compares its presentation, the way this system appears, to a new theatre, a new machinery, so that it is the apparatus in capitalism that brings something into appearance and visibility. It's through this mode of exposition that we then re-encounter the question of Darstellung with which we started. In an early version of Reading Capital, Althusser writes that Darstellung signifies in German, among other things, theatrical representation. But the figure of theatrical representation adheres immediately to the sense conveyed by the word that signifies presentation, exhibition, and, in its most profound root, position of presence. Presence offered and visible. In order to express its specific nuance, he continues, it may be instructive then to oppose Darstellung and Vorstellung. In Vorstellung, one certainly has to do with a position. One takes a position, but one which is presented out front, which thus supposes something which is kept behind this preposition, something which is represented, but that which is kept out in front by its emissary, the Vorstellung. In Darstellung, he says, on the contrary, there is nothing behind. The very thing is there, da, presented in the position of presence. Read back through his scene of interpellation, we'll then ask, what exactly constitutes a scene in which nothing is hidden, but the thing is da, presented in a position of presence? Or if there is no scene that is not a mise en scène, to what extent is this scene of interpellation composed of a staging where the encounter is less a site of capture than the opening of what we might call a certain mimetic instability in what Althusser calls ideology's effective presence. These questions open, no doubt, onto a range of critical references far from Althusser's text, including, I suggest, the different ways of understanding the Aristotelian term opsis, which translates variously as staging, mise en scène, performance, spectacle, and which raises the difficulty whether it is ever fully possible to separate everything that might seem extraneous or supplementary to the scene, props, costumes, lighting, in other words, everything that is foreign to art, mere accessories, seduction, from what constitutes a true poetics, like the voice that draws us into the scene and absorbs us in the intensity of the dramatic moment. Suffice it to remark that the apparatus presented in Althusser's text implies a complicated spatial and metonymic displacement, not only between front and back, but also between inside and outside. So that, as he notes, what takes place outside ideology, to be precise, out in the street, in reality takes place in ideology. At the same time, the apparatus also implies a temporality, and it's a temporality that Althusser is constrained to articulate with some care. Conveyed in its narrative form, the text clearly has to present this scene in the form of a sequence, with a before and an after, and thus in the form of a temporal succession. Someone is walking along the street, there's a hailing, somebody turns around, and so on. But in reality, Althusser insists, these things happen without any succession. The existence of ideology and the hailing of interpellation of individuals as subjects are, he says, one and the same thing. Or rather, perhaps not so much one and the same thing, but the sense that ideology has always already interpellated us as subjects. Even as the temporal unfolding of this always already is also, he says, instantaneous. It happens in an instant. For as he notes, what happens in this instance is eternal, whose specific sense does not mean everlasting, an infinite time occurring outside time, but the opening of another sense of time. Open time, we might say, to its spacing. So that if the question of reproducibility is at stake here, it's to be understood then as without origin or end, and as an incessant interruption, a simultaneous punctuation, discontinuity, flash, trace, vestige, becoming. Not presence as such, but the incessant interruption of a coming into presence or a coming into appearance. A couple more pages. When we come to rehearse this scene of interpellation, we see that its decisive measure turns, as it were, on turning. Even as the event of this turning, its gesture, the way the turning is said to take place through a mere 180-degree physical conversion, is difficult to locate with any precision. Again, Butler has argued, the figure of turning operates as part of the explanation of how a subject is produced, so that there is no subject, strictly speaking, who makes this turn. On the contrary, the turn appears to function for her as a tropological inauguration of the subject, a founding moment, she says, whose ontological status remains permanently uncertain. In this sense, then, the turn appears difficult, if not impossible, to incorporate into the account of a subject formation. What or who is said to turn? And what is the object of such a turn? How is the subject wrought from such an ontologically uncertain form of twisting? In light of Butler's focus on this inauguration of the subject, the final question we will ask then, or the affirmation we will want to make is, what if this ontological uncertainty were also the site of a potentiality, an ontology of relation that recasts some of our founding assumptions concerning the very idea or the very grammar of the subject? For turning as a gesture is always relational. It's always, we might say in Althusser's own terms, a process in relations. And the opening of a rapport that is not a form of intersubjectivity in which two subjects are posed and presupposed, but an irreducible opening toward the other. Interpellation is thus understood as the opening of a space between, close, I think, maybe to Jean-François this morning, the space between that is not the space between two subjects that exist prior to the act of interpellation, but constituted in and as the spacing constitutive of the subject in its own exteriority to itself. The subject created then in and as its exposure. Or again, an instance is always already the inaugural opening of our existence. Exteriority or exposure that is at once contingent, singular, and finite, just as, we might say, a photograph. At the same time, the act of turning permits of no established bond or social relation, no social part or identity, no establishment of a bond or a tie or a contract between subjects that is not always traversed by this act of turning. Literally, this perversion of any social relation as its simultaneous opening toward, of being with one another. Althusser himself will refer at the end of his life to the swerving of an encounter between two existence. In the act of turning away and toward, there is only ever an acknowledgement of our exposure one to and with the other. It's here then that we could refer to a number of other references to turning that allow us to rethink finally the scene in Althusser's text. We've already mentioned Levinas's own references to interpellation, which include, of course, the question of the face, of facing, including that exposure that comes with the nape of the neck. Or might think of the Medusa effect, or Blanchot's rewriting of the Orphic myth, or Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. In light of Althusser's reference to religion in the essay, multiple references, we might also think of other scenes of conversion, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, scenes of transformation and metamorphosis that open toward myriad other scenes of interpellation or encounter, colonial encounters, sexual encounters, the most mundane encounters that continually punctuate the everyday, orienting and disorienting our sense, our experience of being exposed one to and with the other. These are the numerous topoi in which turning and facing are decisive, and where the face-to-face of standing up and facing someone is not the prior condition in which we come to assess what it means to turn away from someone or something. For the face-to-face is only ever one version, one inflection, one gesture, one declension of turning. I'll close by citing Althusser's eloquent commentary on the capitalist system, understood as at once theatre and mechanism. In its emphasis on how something comes into a visibility in and as an apparatus, Althusser comments, "In every case, the ordinary distinctions between outside and inside disappear, along with the intimate links within the phenomena as opposed to their visible disorder. We find a different image," he says, "a quasi-concept, definitely freed from the empiricist antinomies of phenomenal subjectivity and essential interiority. We find," he says, "an objective system governed in its most concrete determinations by the law of its montage and machinery, by the specifications of the concept. Now," he says, "we can recall that highly symptomatic term, Darstellung, compare it with this machinery and take it literally as the very existence of this machinery and its effects, the mode of existence of the stage direction of the theatre, which is simultaneously its own stage, its own script, its own actors, the theatre whose spectators can on occasion be spectators only because they are first of all forced to be its actors, caught by the constraints of a script and parts whose authors they cannot be, since it is, in essence, an authorless theatre." Thank you.